When I was 10 years old, my father took me to a speed skating race. And my first race was 3 laps long, and I got so far behind after 2 laps that I got lapped by every single other boy and girl. And I tried to quit right there, but they wouldn't let me, and I had to finish the final lap alone, in tears, humiliated. I wanted to quit again, but my father wouldn't let me, so a dozen practices and races later, a year later, I managed to come in third in the Michigan State Championships. And that parlayed itself into a career on the national speed skating team and 9 world championships, and eventually an Olympic silver medal. Now, you won't remember me, you won't remember my event, but you'll definitely remember those games for 3 reasons, which I'll share with you now. Her, and of course, this. And again. Now, when you achieve some level of success, an obvious question is, all right, if somebody wanted to follow in your footsteps, what advice would you give them? And the obvious answer is these things. Never give up, never give in, keep working, try harder. And you hear this from athletes and sports heroes and musicians, and it's all true, right? I wouldn't have kept going. I wouldn't have been able to achieve what I achieved if I hadn't focused on words and guidance like this. But I got to tell you, for you here in the room today, I want to tell you something else, that these same words have taken on a new meaning, and I believe for you, they are all a pack of lies. A collective adult neurosis designed unintentionally to steal happiness and success from you. And you say, how can that be? I think these words, they take on momentum, they get bigger, the obstacles you chase get bigger, the delayed gratification you pursue gets farther out, and at some point, you're pursuing something that is actually a weakness. And as you know, weaknesses cannot be overcome. Now, Thoreau would call this a life of quiet desperation. And the rest of this talk is how to avoid what Thoreau calls quiet desperation. Now, I could enroll you in helping me sort this out. So for the next little bit, you're going to be audience participation. I'm going to prove to you that what I said is true. I'm going to do that through some audience participation. So the first thing I'm going to have you do is fill in two statements, and you fill in the blank after I show this, and hopefully you'll know the answers. So the first is some childhood guidance. If at first you don't succeed, try again. Right. Now, the next one you may or may not know. The definition of insanity is repeating the same thing over and over again and expecting something different. All right, so maybe that's too clever, too trite. Let me give you some different guidance. Now, have you ever pursued something for a long time and found yourself at the end of it, a sport, an activity, music, art, a job, a career, and at the end of it you said to yourself, well, that sucked. And here's the kicker. Did it happen in a way that you didn't realize that it sucked until it was over? If so, if you nodded, smiled, or you identified with that, you might be at risk of a life of quiet desperation. Now, I'm going to give you some new guidance to replace your childhood guidance, and it goes something like this. If at first you don't succeed, quit and do something else. And you see the slogans, quitting is cool, quitting is good, I love quitting, and all right, that's not quite right. So instead, I'll replace that guidance with something that was said to me repeatedly as a kid by a guy named Mike Walden, who fundamentally altered my life when I was living a life of quiet desperation, and it goes something like this. If at first you don't succeed, raise your strengths and design around your weaknesses. Let me illustrate. When I was 21 years old, I graduated from Stanford University in California, of all places, and I skated on the national team, training all alone in borrowed time on ice rinks, and I managed to come in 12th place in the World Championships that year. And when I graduated, I then moved in for the first time to the national team training program in Colorado Springs and the US OTC there. Now, when I arrived there with the likes of Dan Jansen and Bonnie Blair, one of the first things they had us do was an assessment, sort of the ACT or SAT of aerobic sport. And I was very excited because I was feeling confident, all right, I hadn't trained with the national team before, I'm going to be doing well in this test. And I remember the first day of this assessment as I walked across campus and into this Army barracks that had been converted into a hospital room, and there was white tile floors, acoustic tile ceiling, and all these machines gathered around a stationary bike. And I climbed onto the bike, and then the room exploded into a hum of activity, and they slathered cold gel over my chest and my back and put these suction cups, and then they wired those to leads, and those leads went to the machines and until I was strung up like a wedding gazebo. And then they said, here, put this on. It was this odd contraption out of an orthodontic nightmare, and it had a tube that they swung over and jammed into my mouth like this. And then they said, ready, and I shook my head, but they weren't talking to me, and then the nurse behind me put an ordinary wooden clothespin over my nose, so I couldn't breathe, and then I had to breathe through the tube, and they said, let's start. And the nature of the test was every 2 minutes we're going to increase the resistance until you reach your max, which I quickly translated to pedal till you die, which is exactly what it was. And for the next 10 minutes, I was on an escalator to hell. It was awful. It just kept getting worse. And every 2 minutes, they'd raise the resistance, and I'd have to pedal faster. And this small intern kept walking out and doing this odd thing. She'd grab one of my fingers and bend it back and stab it with a pin and milk some blood out into a vial and walk away without ever so much as a please or thank you. And this went on for 10 minutes, and by the end of 8 minutes, I was gasping for air, my legs were burning, and I thought I would quit, and that's when they got interested in me. What kind of people are these? I don't know, but they started screaming at me, make it 2 more minutes, so I did. I made it to 10, and by then my pulse was up over 200. And they said, make it 2 more minutes. I made it to 12. My pulse is now at 210. And they said, make it 30 more seconds, and they're in my face. They wouldn't let me go, so I made it 30 more. Make it another minute, and I couldn't. And my legs, my lungs, and my heart gave out at 13 minutes and 26 seconds. So I walked back to the dorms, and I got a manila envelope under my floor with my first assessment results, and I was excited. They had congratulated me. The little vampire had said, you have the best lactic acid of anybody on the team. And I said, that's great. What does that mean? She said, you're good at suffering. Okay. And so I failed to mention something that happened as I left that place. I passed a young man in the hallway walking to the same testing room, and his name was Lance Armstrong, and he offered me some EPO and steroids, and I didn't take it. But I should have, as you can see from the results of this test. At 13 and a half minutes, Lance was only half done. And I had the lowest VO2 of anybody on the team, and the coaches made no bones about what this meant. You're going to have to work harder, you're going to have to train harder, put in more endurance, more aerobic activity than anybody else on the team, so we can train you out of your weaknesses. And that's what they proceeded to do, and that brings up my first point. In order to avoid a life of quiet desperation, you need to know your weaknesses and accept them, which I did not. Now, there was another test, thank God, a couple days later, and I walked across campus to a different barracks, and this time it was just a stationary bike in an ordinary carpeted room with 2 guys in regular clothes. And they said, get on the bike, this is easy, you're going to go 30 seconds as fast as you can go. Great. And we're going to measure your peak and average power output. Fantastic, this is right up my alley. They said, oh, and we're going to put 710 watts of resistance on the bike, so you might want to test that. And I said, okay. So they twiddled the dial, and they said, okay, we're about ready to start. Go ahead and test it. So I pushed down on the pedal really hard, and nothing happened. So I pushed down really hard and pulled up with my left hamstring, and nothing happened. And then I pushed down really hard, and this happened. And I turned to them, and I'm like, hey, something's wrong. Like, no, it's fine. There's just a lot of resistance. Get going. 3, 2, 1. And in the next second, I put every ounce of energy I had in that right quad and this left hamstring. The muscles were standing out of my forearms like razor blades, and I just barely got it moving. But I had a 50-pound flywheel, and then I got it turning, and then I got it really turning, and then I got it spinning, and 2 seconds in, I was up to 60 RPMs, and then 90, and then 120, and 140, 160, 180. At 7 seconds, I was up over 200 RPMs. At 8 seconds, I hit 240 RPMs. I could feel the heat rising from the wheel and smell it in the air, and for the first time, people were interested in me for something other than my failures, and I was looking around the room smiling, and then how does the phrase go? Pride goeth before the fall. And 10 seconds, and I'm dying, and suddenly this thunder cloud hits me like pain, weakness, despair, no oxygen, like I'm drowning. I just want to get back up out of the water. And I can, it's 12 seconds, and I'm under 100 RPMs. And 50 seconds, and I'm down to 60 RPMs. And 18 seconds, and I'm down to 30 RPMs and barely turning. And they're screaming at me. They're in my face, making me keep going. And then this strange thing happened. This buzzing sound came up and over my head like cicadas, and then a gong. And then the lights got lighter, and the darks got darker. And I could see them screaming, but there was no sound. And then it got quiet. When I woke up, I was in another room on a cot. And the little vampire was back, and she was stabbing my finger, and she was very excited about my lactic acid. And the other guy was on the phone, and he was irritating me because I could hear him talking to the doctor, and he's like, yeah, but he's the first one to pass out on the bike. Fantastic. Just what an aspiring Olympic athlete wants to see. And I got my results, and I didn't want to open them up, that manila envelope, but eventually I did that evening, and of course, right? Worst one on the team again. Now, it got interesting because there was different cuts of the data. And for 15 seconds, it turns out I had an advantage. And when you cut the data by individual seconds, it turns out I have a little secret nuclear power for 2 to 5 seconds, which is fantastic in a sport that the shortest event is 43 seconds. So this corroborated what the coaches had already told me in their minds and my mind, which is, all right, we got to train your weaknesses out of you. Now, what it should have told me is that I have a strength, and maybe there's a way to use it, and that gives me my second point. Know and accept your strengths. They're extraordinarily specific, and by the way, I didn't put this together until I was 38, 15 years later. And the coaches put me on a program after this. And the program was designed such that I would put in more work and more aerobic activity than anybody else in the team, and that's what we proceeded to do. And if I was 12th in the world the previous year, I barely made the team the next year. And the following year, in 1992 Olympic year, I didn't even make the team. And I had finished worse than I did since I was 13 years old. That's physically what happened to me. Emotionally, what happened to me is it was like I bricked in the present. I stopped taking stimulus from the present. I pushed my vision and life into the future, and I became mute and judgmental. It changed me. And this is what that looks like. And I didn't want to do this anymore, so I love this quote from Shaw. I became unreasonable. I got a new coach in 93, and I just stopped doing it. He'd say, go for a 100-mile bike ride, and I'd be back in 45 minutes. And he'd be like, wow, you really went fast. So I just stopped the damage, I stopped the overtraining, and I managed to make the team in 93 and make the team in 94. We got the silver medal, and that's not the interesting part of the story. The interesting part of the story starts here because with that, I recognize that I could quit now. I've achieved some of the things I want to achieve. So if I'm going to keep going, I'm going to do it different. I'm going to design around this. And I got perspective. When you're willing to quit, you can get perspective. And as it turns out, it looks just like this. That brick wall, it has edges. And all I had to do was figure out how to design around them. So that's what I did. I quit. I quit the team, not the sport. And I trained on my own in Milwaukee. And for that season, I put in sprints and jumps and all the things I like to do. I also did the aerobic work. I just didn't do it every single day. And I didn't do it back to back. And I protected myself from overtraining. Now, I went to Kellogg during that period, so I didn't go to the Fall World Cups. And so the most important need of the year was the World Team Trials to go to the World Championships. And they were held in Saratoga, New York. Now, there's another thing I did that year as I was training and prep for that meet. I looked at the way we skated. This is a short track, 110 meters around, and we were skating about 120, 122 meters. And I figured if I can't go as fast as far as them, I'll just go less distance. And I tried to skate like this. This is not easy, right? The whole reason we skated wide like that was to sort of spread out the incredible compression in the middle of the corner, which, by the way, results in a 2G compression. So by skating like this, I forced myself to learn how to do a 350-pound one-legged squat on a 1 millimeter wide blade, 18 inches long, while traveling 35 miles an hour at a wall. But I got good at it. And so I went to the U.S. national team trials in Saratoga, and the day I arrived, 6 days before the event, I got the flu, the real flu. Fever, threw up for 4 days. I didn't go to the rink, I didn't skate, I didn't do anything, I lost 10 pounds. And then I showed up to the rink the day of the meet, and I hadn't skated in almost a week, and I put on my skates, and I went to the line, and I can remember feeling never worse than I did as they were preparing to shoot the gun. Weak, miserable, tired, and had no hope of making the team, even the top 16 to make the cut. I shot the gun, and I focused on one thing and one thing only, skating this track. Figured maybe I can skate less distance, and maybe I can make the top 16, and maybe I'll feel better tomorrow. So something interesting occurred. It's run pursuit style. So you've got another skater with you, about 5.5 seconds ahead. And 3 laps in, I could suddenly see my pair skater, and he was really good at this event. In fact, he was third in the Olympic trials the year before when I was fourth. And I thought to myself, well, he must be out of shape. 4 laps in, 5 laps in, 6 laps in, the judges wave him aside, and I'm going by him. And that's when I noticed the change in the atmosphere. Usually it's loud, there's a lot of people talking. And all that was happening now was quiet, except for lap times. And there were faces pressed up against the glass, and I didn't know what was happening. And so I just focused on finishing the race, and I finished lap 7, and then lap 8, and then lap 9. And I went through the finish line, and I coasted around the corner, and my coach had jumped the wall and was standing out there, and I almost bowled him over, and he's got his stopwatch up. He's like, what the hell have you been doing? I said, I've been sick. He's like, no, you don't understand. You just broke your personal record by 5 seconds. You just skated 2 seconds faster than the national American record. You just skated faster than the world record. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't comprehend it. I couldn't process it. And frankly, I never did until many, many years later when I read this great book. Now Discover Your Strengths by Marcus Buckingham. You will excel only by maximizing your strengths, never by fixing your weaknesses. But I spent 4 years trying to do that. And, this is really interesting, you must be able to derive some intrinsic satisfaction with the activity. I had a fantastic year. I had a great time. For the first time, I was enjoying what I was doing. I went on to Worlds and World Cups and won almost every 500 meter I was in. And I have this little piece of paper that makes me proud to this day, which represents the fastest time in the world in the 500 meters that year. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't represent the final result of that event because I did fall in the semifinals and I was unable to compete for the gold medal, but it still makes me feel good. And this is what focusing on strengths can bring you. So I'm going to close with just some practical advice. It's also outside in the lobby around how you can do this. The first is to take tests and assessments. Just know what they are. They are potentially limiting, so toss out the bad stuff or design around it. The second is get an outside perspective. You cannot see your own world from inside your own jar. The third, find a Roy to your Walt, a yin to your yang. Don't try to become somebody you're not. If you're in business, find somebody who isn't who you are. Find somebody who is what you want to be. And finally, and most importantly, I believe this to my core, abide by a 2-year rule. We all know about the 10-year, 10,000-hour rule, and it doesn't apply unless you're chasing a strength. If you're pursuing a weakness, you will get no success. So 2 years, if you've worked really hard for 2 years at something, it's really time to quit or reframe or do something different. And by the way, I know this is super, super hard, but everybody that does it, that quits for the right reasons, says the same thing. That was the best thing I ever did. So I'm going to close. I really, really like this quote from Thoreau, and it has an extension that I wasn't actually familiar with until recently. And it goes like this. Most men live lives of quiet desperation and go to the grave with a song still in them. Just one thing to ask of everybody here in the room. Please, please, don't let this be you. Thank you.